Often the mecca for gamblers sees the jackpot payoff of a political long shot. Bearing 26th of July banners, joyous followers of Fidel Castro sweep triumphantly through the Cuban capital hours after their rebellion had toppled the regime of Fulgencio Batista. The 26th of July refers to that day in 1953 when Castro began his long struggle to overthrow the dictator Batista with an abortive armed attack. With Batista in flight to the Dominican Republic, the celebrating soon turns to mob action and looting. Gambling machines get the axe. Other demonstrations at the University of Havana, where rebel leader Castro first gained prominence. He led student protests against the bloodless coup that brought Batista to power in 1952. American tourists who happen to be present when history is in the making seek refuge at the U.S. Embassy. They are taken safely to the airport. And flown back home to safety in the USA. Rebel fighters fresh from the battlefield in central Cuba pour into the capital to impose martial law and quell the rioting. Beards, a style established by Castro himself, are the uniform of the day for the rebels. Castro follows a more leisurely itinerary to Havana. When he began this campaign with a handful of men, he said, "I will be a hero or a martyr." At 31, he's very much a hero.
Force of all the nations of this continent or this hemisphere will succumb inevitably before the thrust of the Soviet Empire. Castro has rejected the democratic spontaneity of the Cuban Revolution and replaced it with the posturing and trappings of a dictatorship. When Castro first went to the Sierra Maestra, the Cuban communists did not openly support him. In fact, pronounced him a bourgeois. Only when they saw that he had a chance of winning did the communists try to take over his movement. Meanwhile, Raul, brother of Fidel Castro, had been openly active in the international communist student movement. Recently, Communist China awarded him a medal. In Castro's rebel camp, a dominating influence was Ernesto Che Guevara, a professional revolutionary from Argentina who had worked with the communists in Guatemala. At first, the agrarian reforms in Cuba were to have given individual farmers ownership of the land. That was the promise of the Castro Revolution. Instead, the land was taken over by the state. The farmers are now hired hands. Captain Nunez Jimenez, head of the Agrarian Reform Institute, has long been a leader of communist causes. Premier Castro is pleased with him, and so apparently is Russia's Communist Party leader Nikita Khrushchev. The fact is that Fidel Castro has become a preacher of hate, a fanatic who will not stand for the slightest opposition. Hitler, too, spoke like this. Hitler, the Nazi Führer, also hurled invectives and called for the destruction of those he made his enemies. Hitler burned the books of the authors he did not like. Tragically, the same is happening in Cuba today, the same kind of propaganda bonfires. Cuban jails like this one are filled with opponents of the regime. All parties except the Communist Party are denied political activity. Justice has become the instrument of tyranny. The charge is always treason against the revolution. Thousands of freedom-loving Cubans have been sentenced to long prison terms or death by firing squad. Castro's military judges have made a mockery of the words fair trial and justice. In Castro's Cuba, a man's guilt is not subject to proof. The innocent are executed along with the guilty. More than 600 have died before the firing squads, which have become instruments of terror aimed at all who challenge the Castro regime. Arriving in Buenos Aires were these 5 judges of Cuba's Supreme Court, men of conscience who preferred exile rather than serve the cause of tyranny. Interview